Good morning. Our learning objectives for today's session are to formulate a primary impression based on logical and systematic approach to patients with gastrointestinal bleeding, nausea, vomiting, and indigestion, and also to learn the common diseases that cause these symptoms. We first start with approach to intestinal bleeding. Gastrointestinal bleeding can be categorized based on its manifestation or location. Based on manifestation, a GI bleed can be an overt bleed, direct evidence of it can present as melena, which is caused by a prolonged transit of the blood. Hematemesis, on the other hand, can be either vomiting of blood or coffee ground material. Hematochezia is the passing out of red or maroon blood per rectum. An occult GI bleed means that we have an indirect evidence of the bleed and can present clinically as signs of anemia like lightheadedness, syncope, angina, exercise intolerance, or even dyspnea. In laboratories, we could have an incidental finding of iron deficiency anemia on CBC or a positive fecal occult blood test. An obscure GI bleed can be overt or an occult GI bleed, but the source is unknown. Based on location, an upper GI bleed happens if it is above the ligament of Treitz and usually presents as melena and hematemesis. However, a massive upper GI bleed can also present as hematochezia due to the rapid transit of blood in the GI tract, but it is usually accompanied by hemodynamic instability, like a patient who is hypotensive or tachycardic or both. Objectively, CBC will show dropping of hemoglobin. However, a CBC extracted immediately after a bleeding episode may not truly reflect the hemoglobin and can take several hours to reflect the true drop, as the fluid from the extravascular space goes into the intravascular space in an attempt to restore the volume. A lower GI bleed is a bleed that happens below the ligament of Treitz and usually present as hematochezia. However, a slow bleeding, especially in the distal small intestine or ascending colon, can also present as melena. In any patient who presents with GI bleed, the main priority will always be resuscitation. Like in your ABC, you have to have a patent airway, check the patient's breathing and circulation. Resuscitation with isotonic intravenous fluid and blood products may be necessary. Also, correct any coagulopathies and metabolic derangements. All of these interventions must be done in a timely manner. The goal of having a thorough history is to address the GI bleed in a systematic and timely manner. The character of the bleed, the timing, amount, any associated symptoms, any aggravating factors need to be elicited. Pertinent on the past medical history is the history of drug intake that predisposes to GI bleed, like your NSAIDs, your antiplatelet and anticoagulants, usually prescribed in patients with cardiovascular disease. With family history, it is important to note the presence of GI malignancy or liver diseases. On social history, like alcohol consumption, a heavy alcoholic beverage drinker is considered as 7 bottles and 14 bottles of beer per week for women and men respectively. Of course, lesser amount is needed for drinks with more alcohol content. On physical examination, patient can have either recumbent hypotension or orthostatic hypotension, as defined by a drop of 20 millimeters mercury in systole or 10 millimeters mercury in diastole from taking the BP in a recumbent to sitting or standing position. It is also important to note the patient's usual blood pressure because a patient can have a normal BP but be relatively hypotensive compared to his or her usual BP. Tachycardia can also be seen. Both of these parameters will depend on the onset of bleeding, with the acute onset more likely to have both hypotension and tachycardia, while patients with chronic bleeding can be normotensive and have a normal heart rate. A complete physical examination is always recommended, especially if the ABC have been addressed. When it comes to patients with GI bleed, pay particular attention to the presence of jaundice, pale palpebral conjunctivae, palmar erythema, spider angiomata, caput medusae, gynecomastia, any skin lesions, your bowel sounds, presence of organomegaly, and areas of abdominal tenderness. For the laboratory, CBC can detect iron deficiency anemia, seen as microcytic and hypochromic anemia. Also, a decreasing in hemoglobin or hematocrit is appreciated. It is important to note that any adult male or postmenopausal woman with iron deficiency anemia is assumed to have gastrointestinal blood loss unless proven otherwise. Creatinine can be used to detect the presence of acute kidney injury. BUN increases in upper GI bleed because blood proteins are digested and absorbed in the small intestine, increasing urea production. A high BUN to creatinine ratio of more than 30:1 strongly suggests an upper GI bleed instead of a lower GI bleed. The liver enzymes and liver function tests like your albumin and prothrombin time help to detect the presence of chronic liver disease. Prothrombin time and other bleeding parameters can also detect any coagulopathies and must be corrected once detected. Other tests that can be done depend on the primary impression. Your FOBT or FIT can be utilized in the presence of anemia without an obvious source of GI bleed. The Glasgow-Blatchford score is a risk assessment tool to determine patients who will probably need transfusion, hemostatic intervention, and have a chance of high mortality. The lower the score, the lower the chance of morbidity and mortality. This table shows the parameters assessed in the Glasgow-Blatchford score. The more significant the bleeding, as manifested by the dropping hemoglobin, hypotension, increased BUN, tachycardia, syncope, melena, and the presence of other comorbidities like cardiac and hepatic diseases, predict a more complicated course. These are the diagnostics that can help us in determining the source of the bleeding. A whole abdominal ultrasound is primarily used to detect mass lesions or determine the presence of liver disease. The CT scan can also serve the same purpose, but of particular importance is a CT angiography, which could actually detect the source of the bleeding. Endoscopy remains to be the gold standard in detecting GI bleed. The technetium-labeled red cell scan and mesenteric angiography can also be used and will be discussed further in the succeeding slides. Endoscopy can be both diagnostic and therapeutic. It can detect the source of the bleeding and can also be used to stop the bleeding. The type of endoscopy is named based on the area of the GI tract that was seen and examined. The relatively new endoscopic ultrasound combines both endoscopy and ultrasound and used to locate and treat difficult sources of bleeding like subepithelial tumors or vascular abnormalities. Here is a picture of a standard endoscope and some of the accessories used in endoscopy. On your left is a picture of a normal upper endoscopy. On your right is a picture of a normal colonoscopy. Notice the smooth mucosal surface of both stomach and colon. On your left are pictures taken during a capsule endoscopy. Capsule endoscopy is primarily indicated to evaluate the small intestine. Picture A is normal small intestine. Notice the presence of the villi, in contrast to your colon, which has a smooth mucosal surface. Picture B shows multiple diverticular openings. Picture C shows angiodysplasia. Pictures D and F shows ulcers that can be seen in inflammatory bowel disease. Picture E shows a polyp. The picture on the right shows the endoscopic view of an ERCP and the cannulation of the papilla. On the left is a cholangiogram which is obtained when a dye is injected through the catheter and shows visualization of the biliary tree. The presence of a filling defect on the biliary tree on cholangiogram more often represents a stone. The technetium-labeled red cell scan is a purely diagnostic test. It helps locate difficult sites of bleeding like the small intestine. It is quick but can only be utilized in patients with active bleeding, particularly at a rate of 0.04 ml per minute. Its main purpose is to guide further interventions to stop the bleeding. It is best used for patients with intermittent and slow bleeding. A positive scan can show us a hot spot as indicated by the white arrow in the picture. Mesenteric angiography is a radiologic intervention and can be both diagnostic and therapeutic. It is best used for patients who may have severe, poorly localized bleeding and unstable. It is best used for patients with bleeding rate of 0.5 ml per minute. A positive test can be seen as extravasation of dye as pointed by the white arrow. Therapy can be delivered by doing embolization. Treatment for GI bleed can be categorized into four. For the medical treatment, the PPI has been the mainstay of treatment for peptic ulcer disease. The vasoactive agents like somatostatin and its analog octreotide are useful for variceal bleed. Endoscopic treatments for GI bleed include the following: mechanical clipping, thermal coagulation like your heater probe, your argon plasma coagulation, injection, topical hemostatic agents, and band ligation. Radiologic treatment would again involve your mesenteric angiography with embolization. And if all else fails, surgery will be the last resort like a segmental resection. For today, we will be discussing the 6 common sources of upper GI bleed. We start with peptic ulcer disease. The most common cause of upper gastrointestinal bleeding is peptic ulcer disease. This includes both gastric and duodenal ulcers. An ulcer is defined as a break in the mucosa at least more than 5 millimeters in size with depth to the mucosa. Several risk factors are identified as listed in this slide. The most commonly seen are NSAID use and H. pylori infection. The more risk factors present in a patient, the higher the likelihood of developing peptic ulcer disease. These are the main differences between gastric ulcer and duodenal ulcer. One of the important differences is a gastric ulcer can represent a malignancy and should be biopsied upon discovery. A benign gastric ulcer has well-demarcated borders and smaller in size. A probable malignant gastric ulcer has an irregular border and usually larger in size and non-healing after 2 to 3 months of PPI. A duodenal ulcer, on the other hand, is mostly benign and rarely malignant. H. pylori is more commonly associated with duodenal ulcers compared to gastric ulcers. Another main difference is gastric acid output can be low or normal in gastric ulcers, while duodenal ulcers have high to normal gastric acid output. Based on history, the location of the pain is usually epigastric, and the character is burning, knowing, ill-defined, or can be described as hunger pain. However, take note that two-thirds of patients with PUD does not have the characteristic abdominal pain, especially in the elderly. Another importance between GU and DU is the timing of the abdominal pain with respect to food intake, with the former aggravated by food intake but relieved in the latter. Nocturnal awakening is also seen in the duodenal ulcer. On PE, both can be normal, but some may have epigastric tenderness. If complications are present, the physical examination may sometimes reveal abdominal rigidity in patients with peritonitis secondary to perforation. Here are the most common differentials for PUD. You have your functional dyspepsia, proximal GI tumors, GERD, vascular disease, pancreaticobiliary disease, and your inflammatory bowel disease, especially your Crohn's disease. The barium studies have largely been replaced by endoscopy for diagnosing patients with GI bleed. As mentioned, endoscopy is the gold standard, and it is the most sensitive and specific approach. Ulcers can be categorized based on its appearance on endoscopy. The Forest classification is the most commonly used. The classification is utilized to predict rebleeding rate and the need for longer hospital stay. An ulcer with a spurting vessel has the highest chance of rebleeding and would more likely require endoscopic intervention and would require longer hospital stay. While Forest 3, a clean-based ulcer, on the other hand, has the lowest rate of rebleeding and usually can resume feeding and be sent home after endoscopy. There are several acid-suppressing drugs that can be utilized in PUD. The antacids, H2 receptor antagonists, and the proton pump inhibitors or your PPIs. An adjunct in treating PUD are the mucosal protective agents and include your sucralfate, bismuth-containing compounds, and the prostaglandin analog like your misoprostol. Cimetidine is the first H2 receptor antagonist used in PUD. It has a drug interaction with warfarin, phenytoin, and theophylline because of its ability to inhibit cytochrome P450. The other H2 receptor antagonists are more potent than cimetidine. Tolerance is an issue with prolonged H2 receptor antagonist use. PPI, however, has largely replaced H2 receptor antagonists as first-line treatment for PUD. However, long-term acid suppression has been associated with higher incidence of community-acquired pneumonia. Diarrhea is another possible side effect. Another concern is the PPI interaction with clopidogrel, often used in patients with coronary artery disease. Although not clearly established, a recommendation is to take the PPI 30 minutes before breakfast and take clopidogrel at bedtime to minimize competition between PPI and clopidogrel. Bone fracture was also seen in some cases, so caution should be made in prescribing the drug long-term, especially in the elderly population. Another class of drug that has been made available is the potassium competitive acid pump antagonist, and are currently indicated in combination with antibiotics for treatment of H. pylori. For the cytoprotective agents like sucralfate, it forms a viscous paste within the stomach and duodenum and binds to the active ulceration sites. Antibiotics are indicated for H. pylori infection and include amoxicillin, clarithromycin, metronidazole, and levofloxacin. Here is a flowchart for treating PUD. Again, treatment is based on the endoscopic appearance of an ulcer. In a high-risk stigmata of bleeding, like your active bleeding and adherent clot, there is high likelihood for the need for endoscopic therapy like injection with epinephrine or hemoclipping. In addition to intensive PPI therapy, defined as high-dose bolus of the PPI, followed by continuous infusion of the PPI at 8 mg per hour. While low-risk stigmata of bleeding like your flat pigmented spot or a clean-based ulcer usually need no endoscopic therapy and only once a day PPI. This flowchart also shows the recommended diet and hospital days prior to being discharged. Those patients with clean-based ulcers can be discharged immediately after endoscopy, while those with active bleeding need at least 3 days of hospitalization. The next source of bleeding that we will discuss are varices. It is a complication of portal hypertension, commonly seen on patients with liver cirrhosis. It is diagnosed by upper endoscopy, and 1/3 of them will develop bleeding. The two most common types of varices are esophageal varices and gastric varices. These are the risk factors for bleeding in varices. The more severe the cirrhosis, as assessed by Child-Pugh score or the MELD score, the higher the chance of bleeding. A high hepatic venous pressure gradient of more than 12 mm mercury also increased the rate of bleeding. The larger the size and the presence of longitudinal red streak called red whale sign and the presence of ascites, all of them also increase the risk of bleeding. These are the parameters of the Child-Pugh score. The parameters include total bilirubin, serum albumin, INR, ascites, and the presence of hepatic encephalopathy. The higher the score, the worse is the liver function. Child-Pugh score can also predict 1-year mortality, with patients with Child-Pugh Class A having the best chance of survival in 1 year, while those in Class C have the poorest prognosis. As with PUD, treatment of varices can also be categorized as medical, by administering your vasoactive agents like your somatostatin and octreotide. Endoscopic therapy include rubber band ligation for esophageal varices and injection sclerotherapy for gastric varices. Radiologic therapy in the form of transjugular intrahepatic portosystemic shunts or TIPS is a salvage therapy if medical and endoscopic treatments fail. Surgery is an option if all other treatment fails. It can involve shunt procedures, transection, devascularization like the Sigira procedure, which involves ligation of the varices. Liver transplantation can be an option for patients who are viable candidates. These are pictures of rubber band ligation and injection sclerotherapy of gastric varix. Rubber band ligation involves the suctioning of the varix into the cup attached to the endoscope and applying rubber band over the varix. After a few weeks, the band will slough off. Repeat endoscopy after several weeks is often needed to apply a rubber band on the remaining varices until all the varices are obliterated. The picture on the right shows the injection of a sclerosant on the gastric varix. This is an algorithm in the treatment of esophageal varix. Treatment is with rubber band ligation with administration of vasoactive agents. Patient is kept on clear liquid diet for 2 days and keeping the patient in the hospital until 3 to 5 days. As mentioned earlier, TIPS is a salvage therapy. It is indicated for patients whose bleeding persists even after medical and endoscopic treatments. It is ideal for patients with relatively preserved liver function, like those with liver cirrhosis under Child-Pugh Class A. A shunt is created using a percutaneous approach and creating a connection between the portal vein and hepatic vein, thus relieving the pressure and decreasing the chance of bleeding. Several surgical treatments are available for treating varices, as mentioned earlier. You have your shunt surgeries, your devascularization and transection, and liver transplantation may be only considered in patients with Child-Pugh Class B and C. The next source of upper GI bleed that we will discuss is the Joulefoy's lesion. Joulefoy's lesion is an aberrant vessel that bleeds into the mucosa from a pinpoint mucosal defect. It is also called a persistent caliber artery, commonly seen in the lesser curvature of the proximal stomach. Diagnosis is by endoscopy, and treatment is endoscopy with thermal coagulation, band ligation, clip placement, or endoscopic suturing. If endoscopic treatment fail, angiographic embolization or surgical oversewing can be a viable option. The next common source of upper GI bleed is your Mallory-White tear. It is a non-transmural tear at the gastroesophageal junction that is often associated with retching and vomiting. Patients usually present with hematemesis, and most of the bleeding stops spontaneously. Treatment is by endoscopy with possible coaptive coagulation, band ligation, application of hemoclips, or epinephrine injection. This is a flow chart for treatment for the Mallory-White tear. Those patients without active bleeding may not need any further therapy or only be given antiemetics if nausea persists. However, those with active bleeding may need endoscopic therapy like hemoclipping and be placed on a clear liquid diet for at least 1 day and be discharged later. The last source of upper GI bleed we will be discussing is erosive disease. The main difference between erosive and peptic ulcer disease is the depth of the break in the mucosa, with erosions being more superficial. Because of this, it can cause only mild upper GI bleed because there are no arteries and veins in the mucosa. Majority of the cases are erosive gastritis and duodenitis, and less commonly is erosive esophagitis. The most common causes are NSAID use, alcohol intake, H. pylori infection, or stress-related mucosal injury. Stress-related mucosal injury is commonly seen in severely ill patients, including patients with serious trauma, major surgery, burns covering more than one-third of the body surface area, major intracranial disease, and other severe medical illness. Severe bleeding does not occur unless ulceration develops. Pharmacologic prophylaxis may be considered in high-risk patients using PPI. This is an algorithm for patients with erosive disease. Endoscopic therapy is not indicated in this case, and once-a-day PPI may be started. Patient can also be started on regular diet and be discharged after endoscopy. Gastrointestinal bleeding is considered an alarm symptom, so the possibility of malignancy should always be considered, especially in older patients. The most common type of GI malignancies that can present as bleeding are esophageal cancer and gastric cancer. There are two types of esophageal cancer. They are the squamous cell carcinoma and adenocarcinoma. This table shows some of the main differences between the two regarding its location and risk factors. Adenocarcinoma is usually seen in the lower esophagus due to its association with chronic reflux. Diagnosis is done by endoscopy. The most common symptoms are dysphagia or odynophagia and less frequently hematemesis or melena. One theory in the development of gastric cancer is the conversion of dietary nitrates to carcinogenic nitrites by bacteria. Risk factors are listed here and diagnosis is also by endoscopy. One important risk factor is H. pylori infection. That is why its eradication is important once detected. Patients with previous gastric surgery are also at risk, and surveillance endoscopy is recommended for these patients several years after surgery. Symptoms of gastric cancer involve other alarm symptoms like your unexplained weight loss, anemia, may be due to occult blood loss, or overt GI bleed like melena. Presence of new-onset abdominal discomfort in older patients should raise a suspicion of possible malignancy. On PE, it can be normal. Presence of lymphadenopathies may be elicited, or palpable mass or ascites. We now turn our discussion to the common causes of lower gastrointestinal bleeding. We will be discussing the following conditions: diverticular disease, hemorrhoidal disease, vascular ectasia, and malignancy. Diverticular disease is commonly seen on the elderly population, but incidence has been rising in the young in the past few years. Although most will remain asymptomatic throughout their lifetime, 10 to 25% will develop complications, including bleeding. It occurs at the point where the nutrient artery penetrates through the muscularis propria, resulting in a break in the integrity of the colonic wall. Previously, more commonly seen on the left side of the colon, but 70% of the Asian population with diverticulosis will be on the right side of the colon. There are two types of diverticulum seen. The most common is the pseudodiverticulum, which only involves the herniation of the mucosa and submucosa through the muscularis propria, as compared to a true diverticulum, which involves the protrusion of the entire bowel wall. It is the most common cause of hematochezia in patients older than 60 years old. Here are the risk factors for diverticular bleeding: your hypertension, atherosclerosis, antithrombotic therapy, NSAID use, obesity, and diabetes. Diagnosis can be made on colonoscopy, CT scan, particularly the CT angiogram, your TC-labeled red cell scan, and mesenteric angiography. Treatment can be administered during colonoscopy or mesenteric angiography. If endoscopic and radiologic treatment fail, surgery again is the last resort. It can be segmental resection if the source of bleeding is known, and subtotal colectomy in poorly localized bleeding. We will now discuss hemorrhoidal disease. It is the engorgement and prolapse of the hemorrhoidal tissue into the anal canal due to straining. Classification is external and internal if it is below or above the pectinate line respectively. Hemorrhoids present mostly with hematochezia. It can be accompanied by painful defecation, especially if it is thrombosed, or it can also be painless. It can cause minimal or significant bleeding. Patients can have anemia, but its presence may necessitate further tests to rule out neoplasm. Diagnosis can be made through digital rectal examination or endoscopy. Even though hematochezia is considered an alarm symptom, one approach can be, in a young patient without family history of colon cancer, is to treat patient initially with medication and then monitor. If bleeding persists, a colonoscopy can be offered. However, any patient older than 45 years old should be recommended to undergo colonoscopy. Hemorrhoids have different stages. 1 is enlargement with bleeding. 2 is protrusion with spontaneous reduction. 3 is protrusion requiring manual reduction. And 4 is irreducible protrusion. The third column states the different treatment options that can be offered to the patient depending on the hemorrhoidal stage. Take note that stage 3 and 4 already may require surgery treatment. The next common cause of lower gastrointestinal bleeding is the vascular ectasia. They are dilated, fragile blood vessels seen in the GI tract. Like diverticular disease, they are more commonly seen in the elderly population. It can cause both acute or chronic bleeding, or an occult or an overt bleeding. If the bleeding is overt, it usually presents as painless hematochezia. Treatment can be done through endoscopy, embolization, or surgery. Colon cancer was previously considered common only in the elderly population and is one of the most common causes of hematochezia in that age group. However, its incidence have been decreasing due to more compliance with screening practices. Unfortunately, incidents have been increasing in both men and women in the younger age group in the past few years. Listed are the known risk factors for colon cancer. You have your animal fat, obesity, certain hereditary syndromes like your non-polyposis syndrome, your inflammatory bowel disease, your Streptococcus bovine bacteremia, and tobacco use. Based on this slide, right-sided colon cancer commonly present with an occult GI blood loss and may present only as signs of anemia and without a change in the appearance of the stool. While left-sided colon cancer is more often associated with an overt GI bleed like hematochezia and a change in the caliber of the stool. Anemia may be an infrequent finding. Bleeding in the small intestine is rare when compared to both upper GI and lower GI bleed, and only accounts for 5% of gastrointestinal bleeding cases. However, 75% of obscure GI bleeding is noted to originate from the small intestine. The most common causes are vascular ectasia, neoplasm like your gastrointestinal stromal tumor, carcinoids, adenocarcinoma, lymphoma, and metastases. You can also have your NSAID-induced ulcers. This shows a suggested algorithm for patients with acute lower gastrointestinal bleeding. The approach with lower GI bleed will be determined primarily by the presence of hemodynamic instability. If the patient is hemodynamically stable, the approach will depend on the patient's age, family history of colon cancer, and the presence of anemia. Patients who are hemodynamically stable, who are less than 40 years old, do not have family history of colon cancer, and do not have anemia, may be treated more conservatively with medications with or without sigmoidoscopy or colonoscopy. But if the patient has a family history of colon cancer, has anemia, colonoscopy may be offered right away. Also, if the patient is hemodynamically stable but is more than 40 years old, colonoscopy is recommended right away. If the source is not identified, one might consider working up the small intestine. If the site is identified and bleeding persists, treatment should be attempted by endoscopy. If endoscopic therapy fails, angiography and surgery may be needed. For hemodynamically unstable patients, an upper endoscopy is recommended. If no source is found, one can proceed with colonoscopy if the patient is able to undergo bowel preparation, or angiography if the patient is too unstable to prep. Endoscopic or radiologic treatments should be attempted, but if both fail, surgery is the last option. Our next topic is approach to patients with nausea, vomiting, and indigestion. Nausea is the feeling of the need to vomit. Vomiting is the oral expulsion of gastrointestinal contents resulting from gut and thoracoabdominal contractions. Indigestion encompasses a range of complaints including nausea, vomiting, heartburn, regurgitation, and dyspepsia. The stimuli for nausea and vomiting is coordinated in the brainstem, and the response is affected by the gut, pharynx, and somatic musculature. The outcome is the contraction of the thoracic and abdominal wall muscles, resulting in the increase in intrathoracic and intra-abdominal pressures to evacuate the stomach. As shown in this diagram, the stimuli for nausea and vomiting can come from the musculoskeletal system, oropharynx, GI tract, vestibular system, and the chemoreceptor trigger zone or CTZ, usually secondary to drugs or chemicals. Patients who have undergone surgery and chemotherapy also stimulate nausea and vomiting. Once coordinated, this signal is then transported to the nausea and vomiting center and triggers the chain reaction in the thoracic and abdominal area to produce vomiting. The cerebral cortex also contributes by triggering vomiting by psychological factors or smells. These are the neurotransmitters that are involved in eliciting nausea and vomiting. For labyrinthine disorders, you have your M1 and H1 receptors. For vagal afferent, you have your 5-HT receptors. For your area prostrema or CTZ, you have your 5-HT3, M1, H1, and D2 subtypes. And for the CNS is your NK1 receptors. The history and physical exam help to determine the cause of nausea and vomiting and detects its possible complication. The character of the vomitus is very telling. For example, a Billus vomitus rules out the possibility of a pyloric obstruction. A foul-smelling fuculent vomitus indicates the presence of intestinal obstruction. The timing of the vomiting in reference to food intake also gives valuable information. Like vomiting within an hour after eating can be secondary to a more proximal obstruction like the stomach. The presence of other alarm symptoms should alert the physician of a more serious cause of the nausea and vomiting. Any intake of medicines that can cause vomiting must be elicited by doing a thorough history. On PE, again, always perform a complete physical examination. Look out for any signs of dehydration. For the abdominal PE, note the presence of surgical scars, character and frequency of the bowel sounds, note any organomegaly, and presence of tenderness. Here are the wide array of differential diagnoses for nausea and vomiting. It is subdivided into intraperitoneal, extraperitoneal, and medication and metabolic disorders. In inflammatory disease, the presence of Murphy's sign on physical examination points to acute cholecystitis as the cause of vomiting. A woman with a surgical scar from a previous cesarean section can present with abdominal distension, vomiting, hypoactive, high-pitched bowel sounds, can have intestinal obstruction secondary to postoperative adhesions. Manifestations of intestinal obstruction depend on the nature of underlying process, location, and changes in blood flow. On abdominal auscultation, in the early stages of the obstruction, there is presence of hyperactive bowel sounds, but becomes hypoactive later on because of the dilatation of the area proximal to the point of obstruction. The character of the vomitus is determined by the location of the obstruction. These are the most common causes of small intestinal and colonic obstruction. The most common cause is obstruction secondary to postoperative adhesions. In inflammatory diseases like pancreatitis, cholecystitis, or appendicitis, vomiting is brought about by visceral irritation and induction of ill use. In gut sensory motor dysfunction like gastroparesis, a delayed gastric emptying time can be detected. However, a rapid gastric emptying time are also noted in some conditions. Postoperative emesis occurs in 25% of surgeries, especially for abdominal and orthopedic surgeries. An increased intracranial pressure from tumors, bleeding, abscess, or blockage of CSF flow can cause vomiting with or without nausea. Because of the numerous causes of nausea and vomiting, a good history and physical examination are needed to guide the physician on what diagnostic to request for. Here are some of the most common tests requested: your electrolytes, liver and pancreatic biochemistries, for imaging like X-ray, whole abdomen ultrasound, CT scan, MRI, endoscopy. You also have your serologic and hormone abnormalities and gastric motility testing like your scintigraphy and manometry. Therapy of vomiting includes correction of any electrolyte abnormalities and correction of dehydration if present. If oral intake is tolerated, patient can be started on a low-fat diet because fatty food delays gastric emptying time. These are just some of the medications used for nausea and vomiting. For the antiemetic agents, the ones that are commonly used are the antihistaminergic and the 5-HT3 antagonists like your ondansetron, usually used for patients undergoing chemotherapy. For the prokinetic agents, the most commonly used is your metoclopramide, which is an antidopaminergic agent and centrally acting. Domperidone is also an antidopaminergic agent but does not cross the blood-brain barrier, unlike your metoclopramide. Here are some of the side effects of your antiemetics and prokinetic drugs. For the metoclopramide, it can cause irreversible movement disorders like your tardive dyskinesia. Domperidone, erythromycin, tricyclic antidepressants, and 5-HT3 antagonists increase risk of cardiac arrhythmias and sudden cardiac death in those with QTc interval prolongation on ECG. We will now be discussing indigestion. The proposed mechanism for indigestion are the following. Number 1 is your gastroesophageal reflux. Number 2 is gastric motor dysfunction that can include delayed or rapid gastric emptying time or impaired gastric fundus relaxation. Third is your visceral afferent hypersensitivity. Fourth is immune activation due to increased duodenal epithelial permeability, which leads to increased eosinophils and mast cells and their activation, which leads to delayed gastric emptying time and altered sensory function as seen in functional dyspepsia. Immune activation can also be triggered by microbiome alterations. Other proposed mechanisms are your H. pylori infection, anxiety and depression, infections, and certain medications. It is important to note the presence of any of these alarm symptoms: odynophagia or dysphagia, unexplained weight loss, recurrent vomiting, occult or gross gastrointestinal bleeding, jaundice, palpable mass or adenopathy, or family history of GI malignancy. Most cases of indigestion are secondary to GERD and functional dyspepsia and requires no or limited testing. Physical examination can be normal, and some may have epigastric tenderness and distension. This slide shows you the most common differential diagnosis in indigestion. You have your GERD, your functional dyspepsia, ulcer disease, malignancy, your infections, food intolerances, and other extraperitoneal etiologies. The classic symptom of GERD is heartburn and occurs in 18 to 28% of the population. Heartburn is a substernal warmth that moves toward the neck, exacerbated by meals, and may awaken the patient at night. Associated symptoms include regurgitation or water brush, a reflex release of salty saliva into the mouth. Atypical symptoms include pharyngitis, asthma, cough, bronchitis, hoarseness, and chest pain. Physical examination may be normal. However, wheezing can sometimes be present if reflux triggers an asthma exacerbation or a hyperreactive airway. Poor dentition can be secondary to the frequent presence of acid in the oral cavity. Treatment for reflux is with PPI. Functional dyspepsia is the cause of 70 to 80% of dyspeptic patients. Defined as bothersome postprandial fullness, early satiety, or epigastric pain or burning, with symptom onset at least 6 months before diagnosis in the absence of organic disease. There are three types. First is the postprandial distress syndrome, which is meal-induced fullness and early satiety. Epigastric pain syndrome may be not be food related. It is burning and gnawing in character, or you have your mixed type. Typically, no further tests are needed if a patient presents with classical signs and symptoms of GERD or functional dyspepsia and with no alarm symptoms. However, further tests should be considered for the following circumstances: age more than 60 years old, presence of alarm symptoms, and non-response to treatment. Here is a useful algorithm for patients who present with indigestion. For patients 60 years old and above, endoscopy should be recommended right away. For patients less than 60 years old, the approach should depend on the prevalence of H. pylori in the region. With those with low prevalence can be treated empirically with 4 weeks of PPI. If a patient fails to respond, a test and treat approach is recommended. Those with high prevalence of H. pylori should be tested for the bacteria and treated accordingly if H. pylori is present. If a patient fails to respond, the patient may be treated empirically with PPI. The first line of treatment for indigestion is diet and lifestyle modification and include the following: limit alcohol, caffeine, chocolates, fats, and spicy food, stop smoking, eat low-fat diet, avoid snacks before bedtime, elevate head at least 30 degrees, avoid food that you are intolerant, and have a low FODMAP diet, especially in patients with irritable bowel syndrome. So patients should avoid wheat, garlic, onions, apples, and dairies, to name a few. Treatment with H2 receptor antagonist or your PPI can be considered. If H. pylori is positive, it should be eradicated with antibiotics. And agents that can modify gastrointestinal motility, like your prucalopride, and maybe antidepressants like the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors may also help. Other options would include your probiotics, non-absorbable antibiotic like your rifaximin, and maybe psychological treatments. Here are the references for today's lecture. Thank you.
Good morning. This is Dr. Marian Garcia. Do you have any questions for today's lecture? No questions? Okay, so if there are no questions, we will end our today's session. Hopefully you are able to at least have a guided logical approach to patients who presents with you with gastrointestinal bleeding and indigestion. Thank you for your attendance.